Welcome to the Delingpod with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest. I know I always say I'm excited, but I really am excited about this week's special guest. He's back for a second time. It is Professor Robert Toombs.
Hello, James.
Probably the only Cambridge Don who would actually agree to be on this podcast, I would say.
You might possibly be right.
Or is there one more?
No, I'm sure there are a number in hiding.
Yeah. I was watching the other day this amazing series about the art of Japan, and it's by some hot up-and-coming Cambridge Don, I think. And they're not called Dons, are they? What do you call them?
We still call them that.
What's the other word you use? Supervisors?
Oh, lots of words. Well, there are lots of words. Academics, lecturers, professors, readers, fellows of colleges. But Dons is the sort of generic name.
Anyway, so this, I don't know. You've probably seen him. He's really good on art and young and attractive and interesting. And so I emailed him immediately after, and I say, please come on my pod. Zilch, nada. And I reckon probably it's because if you're a kind of lefty academic, I'm toxic. So thank you very much for...
I didn't know you were toxic. Perhaps I wouldn't have come on if I had.
Yeah, exactly. You should have worn your coronavirus mask in case you get infected. You are here partly, apart from you're the only Don I could get, partly because you're an absolute hero of Brexit.
I'm one of the foot soldiers of the great Brexit army.
Well, you are. We're recording this, let history note, on Brexit Day, Independence Day, and I think you are one of the very few people in academia brave enough and intelligent enough and wise enough to have supported Brexit. You did briefings for Brexit were you all? Who were you all?
Well, we started off being three of us. My two colleagues were Graham Gudgeon, who's an economist, and Chris Bickerton, who is a political scientist. Chris went off and founded his own left-wing Brexit group. Right. So there are a number of academics, but they tend to be either quite old like me or young and brave, and many in that case quite a lot on the left. But what is kind of lacking are people, middle-aged, semi-established people, I think, who are often rather scared to put their head above the parapet, even if they think the way that we do about this, simply because their career prospects are likely not to be helped, to put it mildly.
Well, I was going to ask you that. Presumably, you've got a grand title, haven't you? Professor of French history?
Yes, that's right.
Or French, is it?
French history.
French history. Okay. So you're safe. I mean,
yes,
unsackable.
Exactly.
But I imagine you got sneered at over the port, or funny looks, or something.
Well, almost the only thing I've got. I should first of all say that being in this position, which people like you occasionally say, "Gosh, you're terribly brave." Yeah. But in fact, I've made lots of new friends, which I didn't know I have. Oh, yeah. I'm sure I've made more friends than I've lost. Quite sure of that. And actually, some people often sort of come up to me over the port, as it were, and say, I really like what you're doing, and I really like your piece in the Telegraph or whatever. But they often won't say it too loudly. The only thing I've ever had, this was an elderly colleague whom I'm very fond of, who said to me one day, he said, I hear you're in favour of Brexit. And I said, yes. And he said, but you're such a nice chap. Yeah, that figures. The people coming up to you and sort of being surprised and impressed by your Brexit support, were they fellow academics or undergraduates or what? Mainly fellow academics, yeah.
You didn't have any undergraduates coming up shining?
Yeah, I've had some. In fact, I had one on a train the other day. He recognised me, maybe from your thing, and he said, you're Robert Toombs. I said, yes. He said, I like your stuff. I read it in the Telegraph or whatever. And so we talked on the train journey from Cambridge to London, and he's an undergraduate, but he said, I find it very difficult to say among fellow students the way I think. And there are quite a few like that, and quite often they're working class kids, who come from the north of England. In his case, he was, I'm trying to think, he was from an ethnic minority. I think probably a Londoner, but it's quite common for boys or girls from the north of England who come from homes and from a region in which support for Brexit is quite strong. And they find when they come to Cambridge, everybody's on the other side, and therefore they usually keep quiet about it.
Yeah.
And indeed, we have in our group a graduate student who edits our newsletter. But we more or less told her not to let her name be known, because she wants a job in academia. She wants, when she's finished her PhD, she wants a job. And the fact is, it would not at all help. You know, what tends to happen is that people say, well, you know, she's got rather odd views. Is this going to be a good appointment for the faculty's reputation? You know, that sort of, so it sort of whispers often, and that can be enough. I don't want to bore you and your viewers with
special
this,
friends.
Once I was at a conference. You know, academics attend conferences, part of the job, and a man who was a professor, tenured professor at another university, said how much he agreed. And I said, well, that's great, would you like to write for us? And he said, I'd love to, but I'm applying for a job at another university, and I can't possibly let people know what I think until this job's decided. And I thought how shocking it is that this should be the reality. You know, if these people had been communists in the 1950s, subject to sort of McCarthyism, we'd be up in arms about it.
Yes.
And I've had colleagues sort of left-wing colleagues who say, well, you know, 20, 30 years ago there were senior conservative academics, but they never thought of discriminating against young left-wing lecturers. But now I think there's no longer that kind of tolerance for people of different views.
Well, there's an extraordinary, and this is a long-running thing, the double standards between I was talking about this to my previous podcast guest, Christian Niemitz. Why is it acceptable at political rallies in England now to fly the hammer and sickle flag, the flag under which millions were killed? And yet if you try waving a Nazi flag, and this is not to say that we should be waving Nazi flags, but how come the left gets a free pass?
Yes, very difficult to say. And I guess if you ask someone who's waving one of these flags, they'd probably say something like, well, yes, okay, it went wrong, you know, Stalin bad, Mao bad, but the original idea was good, isn't that it? You know, it's like we don't look at the reality, we look at the vision.
Intentions.
A bit like the EU, I would say. I'm not sure if we're going to get onto that subject.
We're so totally going to get onto it, and I liked that segue there. That's really good. You've kept me honest. Exactly. That so much of, you must have noticed this, when you tried pinning down, during the fraught debates we had about the European Union, when you tried pinning down Remainers on what it was about the European project that they found so attractive that we should stay in it regardless, they weren't really able to come up with anything concrete. It was all about general ideas about peace and fairness.
Exactly. And that's not only true in Britain, where of course we've had this debate, as you say, very intensely for now 4 years. I've had the same thing in other European member countries, which we still are till 11 o'clock tonight, in which you might say to someone, but you know, you're Italian or you're Greek. I mean, what do you think about all the youth unemployment in your country, which is due to Eurozone policies? And they don't want to talk about it. They move the subject onto something else about. You know, as you say, things like, yeah, but it keeps the peace, or but what about the wonderful European civilization that we've enjoyed since the ancient Greeks, or, you know, think about the future and how much things can be reformed and improved, but very reluctantly, as you say, to get onto any kind of real engagement with the issues as we would see them, or indeed with our arguments. It's often quite difficult to get an argument or a discussion which you say, well, you know, the thing that I object to in the EU is, for example, the economic policy that it follows, which is very damaging, or I don't like the fact that it's impossible to scrutinise legislation effectively, or that you can't get rid of the people in the Commission who make the real decisions. And sort of blanks out. Then it's not about that. It's about, you know, yeah, but I feel very European, or you know, I like going on my holidays I like travelling in Europe, and you know, I'd like to be able to work in Europe, maybe, which I sometimes think, but you don't speak any European languages. How are you going to manage that? But as you say, I think there is simply a non-meeting of minds. It's been very difficult to discuss things in a civil, rational way because there simply is no engagement. So instead, often, okay, there's been bad temper on both sides. I'm sure we'd agree. We can be even-handed about that. But on the whole, I think no one would deny that there have been far more insults against Leavers, who after all are a majority of the country, who have been accused of racism, who've been called bad names, who've been accused of being stupid, they're old so they should all die, that kind of thing, which you would not normally have in civilized democratic politics, and which of course if you were to use in other contexts would be regarded as absolutely unacceptable, racist, ageist and all the rest.
I was wondering whether maybe one of the reasons there is a irreconcilable divide between Brexiteers and Remainers. I mean, I think some Remainers came around to our side, but
yes, they did.
The hardcore Remainers, is that when you've got the abstract on the one hand and the concrete on the other hand, you're never going to get any meeting of mind, because with the Remainers it's all about ideals. With the Brexiteers,
well, I don't quite agree with that. I mean, I agree that their view of the EU tends to be, in my view, in our view, rather remote from reality. It's not about reality, it's about a vision.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, many of the arguments that were used on our side were about ideals, were about principles, about who is sovereign, who has the right to govern, who has the right to make final decisions.
Yeah.
And in that case, what were the answers? They tended to be very, very sort of bread and butter things like, but it's going to cause unemployment, or it's going to mean that there are going to be customs checks at the frontier, or it's not going to be very easy to travel. So on one hand you have what seemed to me an avoidance of the real issues about Europe.
Yeah.
But when we raised what we thought were the real issues about Britain and about how Britain is governed, then it all came down to really, really rather trivial inconveniences that people thought they were going to suffer.
Yeah.
Which I thought was pretty shocking. And indeed, I think some people on the Remain side of Lisa Nandy, the Labour Party leadership candidate, has admitted that. I think she said something like, on the other side, on the Leave side, they talked about sovereignty and democracy, and we said, oh, but your mobile phone charges might go up. And I think that's absolutely honest and true. It's never been about the true advantages of being in the EU. It's always been about the disadvantages of leaving it, which is, in some sense, is illogical. The two things should be opposite sides of the same coin, but they've rarely been that. It's been a wholly negative argument on the Remain side, it seems to me. Okay, there's a bit of window dressing about the great vision, but even not very much of that. It's almost always been about the bad things that will happen if we leave.
Yeah, Project
Fear.
Yeah. Now, the reason that I think I'm so excited I've got you, and I really want to make the most of, is the fact that you are the author of one of my favourite books in the last 5 years, The English and Their History, which is a doorstopper of a book, narrative, yellow cover, narrative history, like the kind of thing that they don't make anymore, and you made it, and it's fantastic. And I had a real sense of Englishness, well, I mean, Britishness, I suppose, is part of that to a degree. But this awful period we've just been through, the 3 long winters, I suppose you call it, that period from the referendum vote in 2016, when we thought it was over, we'd won, to now, when for a long time it seemed like what would you call it, the deep state, the liberal elite, or whatever, were conspiring to ensure that we never got Brexit.
Yes. Which I think was a huge shock to most of us.
Yeah.
Because I remember, you mentioned the phrase deep state. I was on I think the first time I was ever asked to speak in public on this subject, because I'm a very retiring character, was in Cambridge, and one of the other people on the platform was a former Labour Minister of Europe, Dennis McShane, whom you probably know.
Yes.
And I remember him saying, it's always stuck in my mind, he said, this was just before the referendum, he said, it doesn't matter how you vote, the deep state won't let it happen. Oh. And I thought, oh, come on, that's just science fiction. But of course the deep state, or at least that section of the establishment, politicians, civil servants, the media, the universities and so on, nearly did stop it from happening.
The judiciary.
The judiciary.
Lady Hale and the Supreme Court.
I'm afraid that's true. And I don't think any of us would have believed that possible. And indeed, at the time, I thought this is just silly. You know, we live in a country in which a popular vote is accepted, whether you like it or not. And I think, of course, none of us can actually talk about what would have happened in other circumstances, but I firmly believe that had the vote gone the other way, we would not have tried to sabotage it. We would have said, okay, the people have voted, we regret it, we think it was a bad decision, but we have to live with it. We have to see how things go in future. But it's almost impossible to imagine an attempt to overturn, by Nigel Farage and UKIP to somehow undermine the popular vote, to sabotage Parliament, to nobble the judiciary, as you say.
Yes.
And yet all these things did happen.
They did happen, and we found it shocking. Does that mean that such antics have never taken place in history before?
I guess they've never taken place in history since the beginning of the democratic era.
Which is when?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it's not all that long ago. It's you could say it's either the late 19th or the early 20th century. But I think probably not since the beginning of the 19th century has there been an attempt to really I'm not sure how you'd put it, to subvert the proper political process. Certainly, I would guess not since the passing of the Great Reform Act. So, we're talking about the 1830s,
right.
Almost prehistory for most people.
Yeah.
Ever since then, elections have led to the formation of governments who have governed until they were defeated in another election. But there has not, to my knowledge, been any attempt to destroy a government really from within.
Yeah.
As happened in a sense, with the May government, which was attempted with the Johnson government, but of course Johnson was able to have an election which he won. I mean, you might say, or at least I think I would say, that if one is looking for the simplest explanation, and that's usually a good place to start at least, it's because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act.
Which was put up by David Cameron and George Osborne, I think, and Nick Clegg.
Yes, that's right, it was. So what normally happens, as you know, is that if a government loses the power to govern, it can ask the Queen, in fact, ask for it to have a general election. And then the electors decide, okay, we keep you or we try someone else. This law meant, which of course exists in similar ways in other countries, that you would only have a parliamentary election or the equivalent of a congressional election every so many years. I expect America was one of the examples for this. But of course the difference is we don't have a presidential system, we have a parliamentary system. So what it meant is that if a government lost control of the House of Commons, which it did, then government cannot simply function. It simply cannot function. It can't make decisions, it can't resign, it can't decide where the country should go, it can't pass laws, and it can't ask for a resolution of this problem by going to the country, as we call it, by having an election. And so I think if we get rid of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which I hope will happen pretty soon,
and it's got to.
Then I mean that particular problem will not exist.
Yeah. We don't have, famously, a written constitution, but we do have traditions and a general understanding of how parliamentarians, how the system should work.
Yes.
And the basis of that functioning system is that people act in good faith according to the terms of their office. For example, the Speaker of the House.
Yes.
The Speaker of the House is bound, at least by tradition, to be non-partisan, isn't
Yes. Exactly. And as you say, we don't have a written constitution in the sense that we don't have a single document called the Constitution. We have quite a lot of constitutional laws and constitutional conventions which normally would be thought to apply. These are not things you can just say, well, it's not written, therefore I'm not going to do it. These are often things which are recorded as being conventions and which it's expected that you would obey. I can't, again, think of an occasion in which a high official of state, like the Speaker of the House of Commons, has simply said, well, I'm going to change the rules because I don't like them, which is effectively what happened. And to do so in a thoroughly partisan way. In this case, to say, I don't agree with Brexit, I'm going to try and stop it, which is effectively what he said and what he did. I think we began to feel that the pillars of our democratic system, which, as you say, are based not on a single written document and a Supreme Court which applies that document, but on a whole series of understandings, conventions, laws, and so on, which it was assumed that people would voluntarily obey.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you get people who are not voluntarily obeying them. What do you do? Who is it who has the right to put a stop to it all?
Yeah.
And as I said, normally it would be the electorate, because there would be an election. But if you couldn't even do that, there was no way you could resolve this chaos.
Yeah. But, so I don't think we even mentioned his name. John Bercow was behaving like
very famous man now.
Yeah, but behaving like a bad actor in this whole thing.
Yes.
And how did he get? Is it because we don't have a written constitution that he could get away with it? How did he do this?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, we have what we haven't got, which I suppose in America, at least in theory, you have, is some means of executing the Constitution, if you like. Okay, Donald Trump can be impeached. We used to have impeachment, but that died out in the 18th century. I mean, I suppose the only way you could get rid of John Bercow would be if Parliament passed, perhaps the two houses of Parliament, I don't know, or at least the House of Commons passed a motion removing him from office. But even that, I don't know if that's legal. Yeah. But of course you wouldn't get that happening because the government didn't have a majority, and the opposition was effectively supporting the man who was acting in their interests.
Yes.
So we haven't got a mechanism by which, if people deliberately break the rules in a blatant way, they can simply be stopped. Okay, you might say, well, America doesn't really have it either because impeachments don't usually work. Haven't worked since Andrew Johnson, wasn't it, after the Civil War? But, impeachment is a very difficult and clumsy thing. But we just haven't got a way of making sure that people do obey the rules if they break them. Of course, you might say, well, there's the Supreme Court. But then again, to my horror and that of many other people, it appeared that the Supreme Court itself was not applying the law as it had previously always been understood.
And of course, the Supreme Court, our American special friend is thinking, well, Supreme Court, it's a long-established tradition, and it's the highest court. It was only invented 10 years ago by Tony Blair.
And there is a difference, which in the American Supreme Court now, it's generally accepted that it is a political body, at least in part. There's a huge scrutiny of judges who are appointed to the Supreme Court to make sure that their political opinions are in accord with what the Senate wants, let's say. So there's some sort of check on who it is. The British courts have always been appointed in an unbiased manner, and no one looks at who they are, no one looks at their political opinions, no one asks them what they think about democracy or about Brexit. They're simply appointed on the assumption that they will behave in a completely dispassionate and unbiased manner.
Yeah.
Okay, it pains me to say it in a sense. I'm a small c conservative. I tend to be a defender of institutions, but in the case of the Supreme Court's decision over the prorogation of Parliament, they reached a conclusion, quite a short judgment, which completely ignored and overruled previous understandings of what the law was, with not a single dissenting voice. Now, there's something wrong with that cannot happen.
It was freaky, wasn't it? That no dissenting voices part.
Yes.
I remember that almost for me was the lowest point where I felt really despairing. I felt like we were victims of a sort of judicial coup.
Well, you suddenly realised. I realised that there's no kind of life belt in the store, in the quicksands. You suddenly feel that all the institutions that are meant to be upholding a democratic constitution have crumbled. So what are we going to do? What means is there of trying to get back to normality? Unfortunately, disaster did not happen, because in the end the House of Commons decided that it could not carry on like this, and it could not reasonably oppose a general election, and so it agreed to one. So the Fixed Term Parliament Act, which could only be overruled if 2/3 of members of Parliament agree, did in fact happen. And so we had a general election, and all of a sudden these problems, at least for the time being, disappeared.
Can you give me a sort of a long-term historical perspective, familiar as you are with England right from the start?
Of superficial knowledge.
Yeah, we could do superficial on this show. We're comfortable with that.
Yes.
Of previous moments in our history where the elite, as it were, have tried to frustrate the will of the people and not succeeded.
Well, okay. I mean, I think the obvious example, which in some ways is not helpful because it's a different age, but the whole period of the Civil War, or even the whole period from the Reformation under Henry VIII up until the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So we're talking about nearly 200 years, in which a great religious divide split the country. The EU and Brexit is hardly religious on that level. People are not willing to go to the stake or the block for it. But nevertheless, there is a deep ideological divide. But what you got at the time of the Civil War was, on one hand, the king trying to govern in a way that the law permitted, the fact is, and Parliament saying that we're not going to permit this, we're going to create an authority of our own. And so at that time you did get the political establishment, king, nobility, commons, being divided into two. And what most people don't realise, because we have a kind of myth, okay, on one hand you have Charles I, the tyrant, and on the other hand you have the House of Commons, the people's friend. It wasn't really like that.
Right.
The king was always more popular than Parliament all through the Civil War. And Parliament was in the hands of an ideologically driven minority of Puritans, of extreme Protestants.
Yeah.
The sort of people who burn witches. And, well, at least in their case.
And banned Christmas and maypoles.
And in one of the nastiest cases, executed an unmarried mother, waited till she'd had her baby, took the baby away and then hanged her for adultery. So, sort of Taliban, if you like, Taliban kind of regime. The king was, by any accounts, a much more liberal and civilised ruler than Parliament was. But anyway, that in a sense, that's beside the point. You did then have the establishment splitting for a variety of reasons. And most of the old aristocracy opposed the king. Most of the old aristocracy was on the side of Parliament, which again, very few people realise, because Parliament was their voice. And so, in a sense, what this reminds me of, on a much more superficial and less serious level, is that the establishment suddenly found that Parliament was their voice, not the people's voice. And were trying to use Parliament not to carry out the people's will, but to stop the people's will.
Right. So all the stuff we've been fed about how our history has been an ineluctable progress towards better things. Is that the Whiggish view?
It is, exactly.
Yeah. So it's basically parliamentarian propaganda from a bunch of Taliban-type lefty freaks.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
Right. No, that's interesting. So, in Civil War terms, we Brexiteers would have been
the Cavaliers.
Royalists, the Cavaliers.
Yes, I like to think so. But then I suppose that's because I sort of kind of identify with the Cavaliers, who seem to me a much nicer bunch on the whole. At least they didn't go around slaughtering racehorses and hanging unmarried mothers.
They didn't slaughter racehorses.
Oh! I think the parliamentarians did.
Oh my God! I'm so a Cavalier.
Well, you probably. I think it was Macaulay, who himself was a Whig, but quite a wit, which is the two things don't always go together.
No.
I think he said it was not so much the pain of the animal that worried the parliamentarians, it was the pleasure of the spectators. So that what they wanted was to stop people enjoying themselves doing what they thought were ungodly things.
Which is exactly like antis and fox hunting.
Yeah, it is rather.
Same thing. Yeah, that's very interesting.
And Christmas. I mean, there are people who think we shouldn't celebrate Christmas, after all, as you know, because after all it might offend some people.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, the Puritans thought Christmas was bad because it gave rise to what they called sensual pleasures.
Do you know what? I went through a phase where because I took part in a sealed knot battle.
Did you?
And I was on the parliamentarian side, and so I got fed all this parliamentarian propaganda, and I was saying things like "a pox on the king," "one king, King Jesus," and this kind of stuff. And I was persuaded that actually, that basically I would have been a leveller probably, because they were like, they were
they were cool.
They were libertarians really, and all that. But talking to you, Robert, it makes me realise that actually I would so have been a Cavalier. Although, one thing I've learned is that we think of the Cavaliers of having the best kit, the fancy, the floppy hats. But actually, in battle, the kit was often so similar that the only identifying marks that they would have to sort of have a sprig of heather or a sort of band of ribbon or something.
Yeah. They had flags. Each regiment had its own flag, which the colonel would design. They were before the days in which regiments had standard colours, and so you could put your own motto on your own flag. And somebody, I forget who it was now, did a study of parliamentary and royalist flags.
Oh yeah.
And that's quite interesting because the royalist flags were often more humorous. The parliamentary ones, of course, were much more Taliban-like. One was "Thou shalt break their kings with rods of iron," and their, that kind of thing.
Yeah, lol.
Yes.
And how? So the Cavalier ones were much wittier.
Yes, they were.
This is the most interesting thing I think I've learned today about Brexit. that even then the left couldn't meme. Even then the left were a bunch of humour. Sorry, why I say left? Of course we know. You and I were at a dinner last night where one of the speakers was Kate Hoey.
Yes.
My former MP, Labour MP, impeccable lefty background. I voted I voted Labour twice.
Yes.
And she was a Brexiteer. She was one of us.
Well, there is, there's a so-called blue Labour tendency. I'm not sure whether Kate is in formal terms part of that, but there is quite an old tradition among the Labour Party of being quite close, very close indeed to popular life, popular culture. Of course, in the old days, the trade unions, now much diminished, but a sort of Labour Party that was the party of ordinary people.
Right.
And there was always an element in the Labour Party of intellectual leaders. I mean, the leadership has often been, old Etonians like you. You are.
I know. My son is.
Oh right. Okay.
Yeah, I've social climbed through my progeny.
A very good idea.
Yeah.
So there's always been some tension between the more popular elements of the Labour Party and its more intellectual leaders often. Yeah. But what's happened now recently is that the intellectuals, or at least those who regard themselves as such, have become almost the whole party, and the rank and file have, in many cases, gone over to the Conservatives. But Kate, I think, belongs in a sense to this blue Labour tradition, which is patriotic, non-elitist, in touch with its grassroots, and so on. And I think that's the one that's the part of the Labour Party that has been most alienated by the antics of the last few years, and many of whose supporters have come over to voting for Boris Johnson.
Hasn't one of the best things about being a Brexiteer realising that one is on the side of the people?
Yes.
And you're saying that in the Civil War time, would the people have been mainly on the side of the king?
Well, the people... Well, yes, I think, almost certainly true. No opinion polls in those days.
No.
But when the king was captured, for example, when he surrendered to the Scots, as he did, and then was handed over to Parliament and became a prisoner, wherever he went, there were cheering crowds. And one reason why they had to execute him was because he was too popular.
Right.
And of course the monarchy was brought back in 1660 by popular acclaim, when people got so fed up with Parliament that they wanted the king back.
And indeed somebody has made this point. I mean, Boris is a famous swordsman. He is rather like Charles II. This is like the Restoration.
The Merry Monarch.
The Merry Monarch.
And people one funny thing perhaps about our political culture is that people quite like politicians to have a sort of lightness about them. People like you think the people who are least popular in history, people like poor old Neville Chamberlain, for example, not a very funny man, I think.
Yeah.
And the people who are popular, of course, Disraeli is one, Churchill is one, both great wits. Boris, in a sense, may be one. He gives the impression of being the sort of chap you could go to the pub and have a drink with. Whether he is or not, I have no idea.
But then he'd shag your wife.
Well, you'd have to go on your own.
Yeah, he definitely would.
But I think people do like to feel their politicians are sort of like them and can laugh at the things they laugh at.
Yes.
And they don't like people talking down to them, and they don't like people being sanctimonious. And Jeremy Corbyn, who people say is a very nice chap, he always gives this impression of being a sort of puritanical preacher, a sort of Old Testament prophet who's denouncing sin and telling you you've got to be different because you're a bad person.
So are we talking really about Merry England here?
I suppose we are.
Brexit is a revival of Merry England?
Well, if we're lucky, it will be.
Yes.
I hope it will be.
Can we go through history, through a few moments, and decide which were the Brexiteers of history? So, okay.
Robin Hood and his merry men.
They would have been
I think so.
Brexiteers.
Didn't like being ruled by the Normans.
Hereward the Wake?
Hereward the Wake, definitely.
He'd definitely have been, one of us.
Yes.
What else? Peasants' Revolt. What was that?
Well, it was partly revolt against serfdom and against the poll tax. So you could say that's a kind of a right-wing not liking high taxes on small businesses.
Yep.
But it was also quite a patriotic movement because they thought the king and his ministers had not been protecting them against the French. The French had been raiding the coast of Kent, and it's in Kent that the Peasants' Revolt begins.
Right.
So it's a mixture of wanting I'm using somewhat modern terms, a small state.
Yeah.
No high taxes, no serfdom. We don't want to be bossed around by.
Yeah.
And we don't want these foreigners raiding our coast.
Yeah.
Now, does that remind you of anything?
Yeah, slightly. Yeah. Yeah.
What?
Well, yeah.
Yes, I
exactly.
Yeah.
Wars of the Roses. That's too complicated, isn't it? We don't.
Well, that's largely within the aristocracy.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of most people didn't get involved in that.
Well, unless you were a retainer, in which case you were kind of dragged in.
And you were professional then.
Okay. What else have we?
Well, of course, there's you were saying earlier. Has there been a time in which, at least I think you were getting towards this, in which part of the established elite were in fact loyal to something outside the country?
Yes.
I mean, George Orwell
Ultramontane, isn't that kind of?
Well, I was thinking. George Orwell talks about communists in the 1930s.
Yes.
But then there weren't very many of them.
Yeah.
Okay, there may have been some of them were quite prominent and influential in academia and in the media, but they were not very many of them. I mean, you might think of again the Reformation, in which part the Catholics were whoever side you're on, whether you think they're a persecuted minority or if you think they were trying to restore a sort of theocratic system, the fact is they were for a time loyal to an authority outside the country. Queen Elizabeth I had been declared a heretic, deprived of her crown by the Pope, and you have people within the country who are plotting to overthrow the government, the Queen, and to bring in, they hope, a foreign invasion to bring Britain back, bring England back to the European system, the predominant European system of Catholicism. So that's we can make these sort of rather facile comparisons with now, but it's not. It hasn't. I suppose my serious point would be that there have been very few occasions. You mentioned the Jacobites, a similar kind of period in which part of the ruling class were loyal to a government that was outside the country. Yeah. But it's very rare for that to have happened to us. We've been rather fortunate. So I would have thought not since the mid-18th century until now has there been a substantial part of the nation's elite which seems to have placed its primary loyalty in something other than its own government, its own electorate, its own institutions.
Yes. What would you say are the characteristics? How the English, British, let's use the terms interchangeably, are there certain characteristics that we've had that have remained with us for a long, long time through the centuries and which came to the fore during Brexit?
Well, of course I don't think we can speak about the English and the British interchangeably because we know the Scots are very different in this matter.
Yeah.
But what are the characteristics? Well, I think the one that's come to the fore most probably is that although we usually are a fairly deferential society, perhaps, one in which people don't really want to rock the boat too much, in which they don't like extremism in politics. Extremism is a bad word.
Yes.
They don't like ideology.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, they all of a sudden were saying, you people, the government, the politicians, Parliament, the experts, the business lobbies, the universities are telling us what to do, and we're not going to do it. We don't believe you. And that, I thought, is perhaps an English or a British characteristic which I suppose one could call bloody-mindedness.
Bloody-mindedness.
People tell you that you can't do this, and therefore you want to do it. Or they tell you you must do this, and therefore you say, well, I'm not going to.
Is that a characteristic that we have that other European countries don't?
Well, the French have it, I think.
Right, yeah.
Is
that why
President Macron has found out to his cost in recent
Yes, that's
months.
true.
But then the French tend to be more violent. It's not the British, on the whole, don't go out in the streets to riot. I mean, the whole Brexit thing has been completely non-violent.
Yes.
And it's not something that most people do very readily. You don't get British old age pensioners blockading the railway station. In France, you do. I mean, it's a lot of the Gilets jaunes have been quite old people, well, middle-aged, elder people. So we don't do that, but people kind of are stubborn, even if they're not necessarily very demonstrably
Yes.
So it's not that they go around telling everybody what they think, but deep down they don't like being bossed around.
Why are we less violent than the French?
That's a good question. And I'm not sure what
Because
the
we beat them loads
answer
of times.
is. Well, of course we are capable of being rather violent. In fact, extremely violent when... of course there are elements in our society that are violent.
Yeah.
But I think there has been a kind of inhibition against political violence for quite a long time, in which people don't like it, and it doesn't pay politically. Violence tends to have a counter effect on your cause.
Yeah.
Because most people think it's not legitimate to use violence. That's not the case in France. The other thing is, I think governments in France tend to listen less, probably. A great generalisation. But the president of the Fifth Republic in France is a very remote and Olympian figure, as President Macron announced he was going to be. And therefore, if you feel that nobody's really listening to you, you can't get rid of the government. Of course, they have a written constitution, which means you can't get rid of the president. Well, what do you do if you're very upset? No point in writing to your MP.
You put on your yellow
vest and you go and kick up a stink in the street.
Right. So this is a kind of pivotal moment in our history, isn't it? I mean, people are going to have a field day analysing all this.
I hope so. I mean, I'd like to think it turns out to be not such a huge change, that we shall find that life goes on happily, peacefully, calmly, and that people will look back and think, what was all the fuss about?
Yes.
That's what I rather hope.
Yeah, I do too. I don't want sort of bitterness like like you have in France, where when you go to a village and you can still find two boules terrain, one where the people who were collaborators play, and one where the people who were resistants play. Yeah, good.
So I think, after the Civil War, which of course was infinitely worse than our present little disagreements over Brexit, people seem to have got together again quite quickly afterwards.
Did they?
Yeah.
How many died in the Civil War?
Oh, I can't remember, but it was as a proportion of the population more than in the First World War, for example.
Really?
Yeah. Of course, a lot of that is death from disease, from general disturbance of the economy and so on. But a lot of people died. But families that had broken up got together again quite quickly, and it seems that people quite consciously decided that they'd got to put this behind them. We can't do this again. We're not going to go back to this. We must, in future, find a way of getting on in a peaceful and civilised way. So I hope we shall do that again.
Well, I'll drink to that. I think we can be magnanimous in victory, can't we, Robert?
We are.
Good. Thank you.
As long as we've got victory, we're
yeah, right. Otherwise, maybe not.